Why don't we get going tonight? So one of the things I want to talk about tonight as part of the group, which is typically the first thing most people always ask about in regards to note investing, is sourcing notes, or where are some places that I can start looking at notes and starting to review to get an understanding of those. So that's what I wanted to have as part of the topic for the group tonight. And as the main focus, I do have a few other things I just want to talk about in general during upcoming meetings and some other things that are going on. And one of those is, if I can get my screen to go to the next, is some upcoming events. And one of the events that I have found extremely helpful for note investors on several fronts. One is learning who the players are in the industry, but also picking up a lot of great tidbits and information, and just hearing a lot of different speakers. Is Scott Carson has what's called Note Camp, which is a virtual online 4-day webinar that starts tomorrow at noon and goes all the way till Sunday evening. And it covers basically every single aspect of note investing. He has 30-something speakers on there, including, actually, I'll be speaking tomorrow evening and on Saturday afternoon. And overall, typically costs, I think, $3.99. I can get people $100 off of that. It is recorded, so you don't have to be at every watch it. You can go back and watch it at any point in time. And the other thing that's pretty I think relevant is when you sign up for any of his trainings, and Scott is who, I'll be honest, is the one where I learned all my note stuff. You get to join his, what he calls the WCN crew, which his company is We Close Notes. And it's an online Facebook group of about 500 or 600 people that have taken his trainings. And in there's a lot of helpful and useful information where it's kind of, you can go in and ask questions and get a lot of responses from people, or if you're ever looking for a certain type of person, attorney, whatever the case may be, it's really a very helpful group to get information from, or just ask people to chat with people in regards to that. So that's coming up this weekend. And then at the end of the month, he also has a virtual note buying workshop, which is really involved in that. I believe it's 3 days, where the first day he spends breaking down how to bid on assets. Then he spends a day going through what I'm going to touch base about tonight and some of the things on where to source some notes. And then the third day is just on marketing and other, people that you'll be dealing with. And again, that is at the end of the month that he has as well. That was actually the first training that I took, was part of, I'd say, the education in note investing, was the virtual note buying workshop. And again, it's 3 days. That is also recorded, but that is something I think you're better off doing live, because you can ask a lot of great questions and get answers on as well. And then the other thing, just upcoming events, is we're going to have an in-person meetup, either December 12th or 13th. Just trying to finalize a few things for which night for the schedule on availability. I'm looking at having it in the Northern Virginia area, in Falls Church, Annandale, Alexandria, somewhere, in that area for people. So I've been talking with Fairfax County, and actually got approved with Fairfax County to be able to use their facilities, whether it be schools, libraries, and stuff. I've also been speaking with City of Alexandria in regards to getting permission for some of their spaces, because I know we got people in this group from all different areas, and some people up in the Silver Spring area, which it's probably not very, it's not easy to get down to Virginia, and same thing, Virginia, if I have one up in Maryland. So I think what the intent will be is to rotate between locations. I'm going to try and have all of them be online as well. So if we have one in a location people aren't around, that they can watch it online, as well as have these also online as well. So if it's not, basically like tonight, we all can just sit home and watch something online, still ask questions, get feedback. But I think definitely want a mix of in person and online, so we all get to meet each other, get to know each other, and we can all work off each other's strengths and weaknesses. So with that, also a few special announcements that I just like to make, and this is really a self-promotion for myself on two of these. One is I'm in the final throes of launching a podcast called the Good Deeds Note Investing Podcast. Gail Greenberg, who is a note investor out of Philadelphia, and I have launched this. We've recorded 7 or 8 episodes already, and it's been released to iTunes, which takes a little time, but those should be hitting iTunes, Stitcher, and other websites at the end of this week and next week. And what we really are discussing is kind of our stories of some of the notes that we've bought or stories we've heard from other investors, but also give the perspective of being somebody who's been in the business for a few years, not someone who's been doing it for 10 years and runs a $20 million fund, where they may have forgotten some of the initial lessons or hard lessons that may have been learned. So while some of our wounds are still fresh in our minds, so we're telling those stories and stories with borrowers and so forth and so on. And one of the things we're also going to be doing is we're going to be having a call-in, like a webinar like we're having today, where if people have questions, they can log in, call in, and we can answer those questions through a webinar, which will also get recorded as part of the podcast. So also people sometimes might be embarrassed or afraid to ask a question. There is no stupid questions in note investing, but you might hear a question from somebody else that at some point in time you can reach out to us, call in, and we'll be happy to answer that. The other thing is just, again, I'll be guest speaking on Note Camp this weekend, tomorrow at 6 o'clock Eastern, and then I think 3 o'clock on Saturday, be part of a panel just talking about just all different aspects of note investing. And the last thing I want to note is many of you may have heard of a company called FCI or FCI Exchange, which was a website where a lot of people would start out buying their first note or start looking at notes. An email came out last week that they have shut down the site and they're rebranding it. And FCI as a company is still servicing loans. So if anybody out there has bought a loan, was thinking of using FCI as a servicer, they're still servicing loans, but their sales platform, they've rebranded it, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So with that being said, does anyone have any initial questions on anything in regards to getting these meetups going and or anything else? And as we get to the end, we'll have a quick question and answer and have people start talking about some topics for the next event, which I have some ideas, but also like to get people's feedback based on experience. So if nobody has any questions, just want to roll into, again, talk about who are some of the note sellers. And by the way, this is being recorded. It's also, I'll send out the PDF for people. So the next slide, you don't have to start scrambling to write all stuff down. So I just put up, 15 plus websites that are online right now that are places where people can go and buy notes or look at notes. What I recommend to people as they get started in this business, and even for those who are experienced, is sometimes to go on these sites and just start looking at notes for pricing or reading history and just taking a look, just to familiarize yourself with what some of what's on the sites, the information, and then start looking at it. And if you have questions, start writing down those questions and starting asking people, questions. I've got a future slide that comes up, is the interaction once you start looking at these and you interact with a seller. What are some of the questions that go back and forth? And we'll talk about that in a minute. But right now, just these websites. So the first one, Exchange Loans, that's actually the rebranding of FCI Exchange that just launched. It's probably the largest, or FCI was the largest and most well-known. And what that was is typically a lot of larger firms, including individual investors, could go on there and post loans for sale. Another one is one called Loan MLS, which lists loans, and typically these sites will list both first and second loans. So whether you're investing in first position or second position, you can typically find both of these on these sites. For me, as I think many of you know, I only invest in first, but I do know some local people who invest in seconds, and be happy to, if you have questions, if I can't answer them, send you over in their direction, and they could be of assistance as well. The third one, it's a newer website by a guy, Brett Berkey, who I know, called PaperStack. And PaperStack is picking up a lot of steam because of just their platform, as well as some of the due diligence that they require and they look at, as well as kind of review assets as well, because on exchange loans or FCI, typically a lot of stuff, just be honest, is overpriced. And PaperStack tries to work with people to tell them sometimes, hey, look, don't even bother listing that on my website because it's just taking up space if something is overpriced. And then the fourth one is Madison Management Services. Now, Madison is a servicing company, who I use. They're out of New Jersey, and as a servicing company, similar to like FCI is, they service the loans. They also have a sales platform that if they have people, so like myself, I have, I think, 60 loans boarded with Madison right now. If I wanted to go sell a few, I could tell Shante, is their office manager, hey, Shante, I want to sell these 3 loans. Can you put them on your platform? And she would put them up for sale on the platform through Madison if I wanted to try and move those. So Madison typically lists assets that are under their servicing that people may be looking to move. And we can get into a whole nother discussion on why people sell loans, and there's many different factors. It doesn't mean it's a bad loan. I know of an investor right now who is involved in a foreclosure suit that's probably going to cost him about 25 grand to defend, and he's trying to sell off 3 loans for basically whatever he can get to pay for his legal fees. So it doesn't necessarily mean people sell loans because they're bad. Number 5 is a company called Nationwide Secured Capital. I don't know too much about them, but I've heard their name tossed around a little bit throughout the industry, so I did want to include them. The next one is First National Acceptance Corp. So First National is also a lender, and they primarily buy loans. So if you have performing loans, and one of the rules that you hear a lot of people talk about is if you have a loan that might not be performing after 12 months, you want to try and resell it as a reperforming loan. First National is the company that buys up a lot of loans similar to that. They typically will buy them even if they've been seasoned, which means they've been paying less. They'll look at the borrower's credit score. I think if it's above 550, it gives a check mark that they'll keep going. And but that's somebody they do sell, but it's somebody that when you start investing and getting some loans, if they're performing and you're looking to move them, First National is a company that is interested in buying them. Next one is American Note Exchange. Again, they also buy and sell loans as well. I haven't bought anything off of any of their exchanges, but again, I've seen some of their marketing materials as well, but I think a lot of their loans are from a fund that they run that they try and sell off. Same with the next one, Note Trader Exchange as well. And then the next one is Notes Direct, which is managed by some well-known note investors as well, that has assets listed for sale periodically. And then the 10th is Watermark Exchange, which is Joe Manuel Satir, who runs Watermark Exchange. He's out of New York. He has a fund that he typically buys large portfolios on, and then sells off some of those assets from the fund through the exchange. Also, investors will go to Sal and say, hey, I've got these loans, can I put them on your exchange to sell? The thing I'll mention about Watermark Exchange is they have a calculator that on their website that calculates the different scenarios. And I recommend anybody just get a login and password and go look and play with their calculator, because I know a lot of investors will create a note calculator for forecasting returns based on what's on Watermark Exchange, because it is actually a very, very good tool. It's the best calculator online that I've seen out of any website. So that's one that I tell you, you can set up a free username and password with it. And that's one that you can go look at loans, but I'd also, if you look at one, play around with the calculator a little bit, because it's pretty interesting. Next one, Colonial Funding Group. That is a site run by gentleman Eddie Speed, who is a big name in the note industry. Him and Scott Carson are the two, I think, biggest note educators in the space. There was just in Texas, I think last week or the week before, Eddie at his note school, or his big conference down in Texas, I think it was November 2nd, a few weeks ago. A lot of people go to that event. I think it's a worthwhile event to go to. But this is Colonial Funding Group is their selling asset arm that they list notes for sale. Next, Paper Assets Capital is, again, similar to some of these other ones that they buy and sell assets, and they'll have some periodically. Investor MLS. Investor MLS, from what I've found, is a lot more originated notes versus, I'll say, bank originated notes. It's somebody doing seller financing and looking to move it at the end of the day. So I haven't done too much research on that site, because I don't typically buy notes that are originated by an individual, because especially if it's not being serviced by a third-party servicer. Then Capstone Capital USA, that's a smaller fund that does sell off some assets that you can check out their website. Main Street Capital Partners, they sometimes have decent inventory to sell. There was a hedge fund called Granite, which recently closed down, and Main Street Capital has been selling off their remaining assets. So I've seen a lot of tapes and stuff from them recently. Challenge has been the pricing that expectations have just been off the charts, so haven't bought anything. The biggest source I have bought probably in the last year is the next one. It's a Direct Source, directsourcere.com. John Keith is a gentleman who runs that. He has a lot of connections. He's been around the block for probably 20 plus years, has a lot of relationships with hedge funds in regards to notes and contract for deeds, which are basically rent to own. And he sends out, besides the website, he sends out probably once a month a list of 300 to 400 assets that he sends out to everybody. And, it's a rolling bid. So you get your bids in, he'll get back to you with, a counter, an offer. And eventually when we start looking at some tapes and so forth that I show some people, if you want to look at how to bid on assets, it'll probably be one of his tapes because of the amount of assets are on there. And last place to find people who sell notes, and I put my logo there, but it's other note investors. I sell notes that, I sold one to a gentleman who's on this webinar tonight that I did get the money today, by the way. When I got home, I checked and the wiring came through. But, there's a lot of note investors who, like myself, all buy 8 to 10 assets at a time, and might be 1 or 2 in there that I'm just looking to, turn around and sell off, or, make, small little fee on it and so forth. And you'll find a lot of investors like that. If you join one of these Facebook groups like a We Close Notes, you'll find people on there all the time, or there's several Facebook groups, which I could put on, would be another one to add here. If you just look at note investing on Facebook, there's probably 5 or 6 groups, and a lot of them do sell or have people that post assets on there. So But those are some of the primary online sources where you can quickly go and get some. Now, you'll hear people talk about banks, hedge funds, and other sources. If it depends on your experience level, is what I would tell people. If you're just new to note investing, start just looking at some of these sites and getting an understanding for kind of some of the information that's provided. Because the last thing you want to do is call a hedge fund or a bank and not know what you're talking about, because they'll see right through you. The way I always explain it to people, it's like walking into an auto body shop and you know nothing about cars and try to talk about, a type of engine to the mechanic that's there. He's going to look at you probably with 6 heads if you don't know what you're talking about. But you don't have to have the infinite knowledge, just have to have enough knowledge. What I say is to get you in trouble. So, but once you start understanding some of those, then, it's all about networking with, reaching out to, there's, probably 5 or 6 hedge funds that primarily sell, as well as with the banks. The banks is a crapshoot. You can call 100 banks, you may get 1 to return a call. I had probably out of 5,000 emails I sent, I had a bank send me a tape a week and a half ago. It was actually 4 assets on it. Got them under agreement. Then when I did the due diligence on it, one of the properties was condemned. 2 of them were vacant, and the last one was occupied, but half the siding had blown off the house. And basically I went back to the seller, and there was a new judgment placed on them as well. So the notes were basically junk. So I ended up passing on it. Does anyone have any questions as we continue to move on? Just checking the chat here. So everyone's still here with me, so make sure I'm not talking to myself.
We are here, man.
Okay, thank you. So, okay. So next thing I wanted to do is, as you start looking at these sites, say you did talk to somebody, and I wanted to just discuss some of the key terminology, questions to ask, and questions that they may ask you as part of discussing with somebody. So on the left-hand side, I've got 6 questions that typically are the standard questions that you should always ask, which are, are you direct with the seller, or are you the seller? What are the pricing expectations? And I'll read these. You can read them all, and I'll just run through each one. But the reason you want to know if they're direct with the seller is because sometimes they may be like, I may get a tape of assets from somebody, and then I may share them with somebody, and then that person is trying to wholesale them. Now, wholesaling notes is completely different than wholesaling real estate, and there's a lot more involved, and you need to kind of have a real thorough understanding of the note and everything. And if you're not, if you're not direct, like if I sent one of you a tape and then you tried to sell an asset on that tape as trying to wholesale it, I'd recommend against it, because a seasoned note investor will see right through you, and you'll end up being termed what's called the joker broker, which we'll talk about later. And once you get that reputation, it's very hard to overcome it because you're not taken serious. Next is, what are price expectations? Because I've gotten asset tapes that may have 100 assets on it, and there might be 30 of them I look at and I'm like, ooh, these look decent. But then if the seller comes back and says, I want 80 cents on the dollar, I'm not even going to waste any time looking at it. I'll say, thank you, but I'm going to pass on them, because at that price point, you're not going to be making any money. So you always want to try and get an understanding for what the pricing expectations are. Sometimes they'll say they don't know. And if they don't, that's okay. But sometimes they'll put on there what the expectations are. And even though they're on there, it doesn't mean that you have to bid their expectations. You can always bid, a little lower, just to see. But sometimes some sellers stick to their guns, some don't. But it's always good to get pricing expectations because sometimes there's certain people who just want way too much, especially if it's an individual transaction. Like if I was selling an asset and, basically didn't put a price on there on the individual. So you should ask me, because if I come back and say, yeah, I wanted 80 cents on the dollar for this one, don't bother waiting. It's one of those things where, you shouldn't waste your time looking at it. Next is it a rolling bid or is there a bid due date? So what that means is on a rolling bid, if you, and most of these are in the cases of where somebody sent you assets, not you're on a website looking at them. But if somebody sends you assets, you ask, if it's not listed in the email, is it rolling bids, meaning first come, first serve, where, I put an offer in tomorrow, or is there a bid due date? Sometimes they'll send them out on a Monday and said, we want all bids due by Friday at 3:00. So just an understanding of when bids are due. You'll ask sometimes who services the loan. And the reason you'll want to know this is two reasons. One is it can set up red flags if they don't know, because it means they're not their assets or they're not very familiar with them, which goes back to that term joker broker we'll get to in a second. But also to make sure it's a licensed servicer. If you're buying from a very reputable individual, including the ones that I had on that last sheet, typically it'll be a major player like FCI, Allied, Madison, SN, be a server that services those. But again, if you're talking with John Doe from down the street who you met on a Facebook group, he may be self-servicing it, which in some states is illegal. And that's one thing that I do not acquire is notes where somebody has been individually self-servicing them, because it can lead to major legal issues. Next is, can we cherry pick? What cherry pick means is bid on them individually. So if somebody has 10 assets on a list, sometimes they'll want what's called a portfolio bid, which is you have to bid on the whole thing as 10, or what they'll call as a loan level bid is another term, which is you bid on each loan individually, which allows you to cherry pick, which is you don't have to bid on all 10. You could bid on one, you could bid on 3, or you could bid on all 10. So that's what the term cherry pick means. And the last is, how long do they allow for due diligence? And we talked about this a little later too. If they want you to close in 48 or 72 hours, run. Run far away, because it's not enough time. It's typically it's somebody. It's unreasonable. If somebody asks, well, how long do you need? Typically, what I tell people is 7 to 10 business days. And that's typically normal, because what you'll say is, if I get my bid accepted today, it's going to take you a day to get me the collateral. Then once I get the collateral, I'll order an O&E report, and I'll order a BPO, or broker price opinion, and you order that title report. The title report takes 3 to 5 days, and then you're going to have an attorney review it. And it's going to take a day or two for the attorney to review it. So right there, you're at 7 days. And then if you're funding with an IRA or something, that's going to take a few days. And most sellers, as long as you communicate with them throughout the whole process, will typically, that's what their expectation is. But what I would tell you is, don't get to day 10 and then all of a sudden say, oh, I'm not buying the asset. Or, basically stay in communication, saying, hey, look, I've got the BPO, it looks good, or I'm waiting on the title, but there is an issue with the property value because you said it was 60, it's only worth 40. Let me get the title report wrapped up and I'll get back to you, but I just want to let you know that this did come up as a flag. So, and then again, some of these warning signs when you're asking some of these questions. If they ask for an NDA, which is a non-disclosure agreement, that's fine. Basically what that is you're getting information that is the borrower's name, possibly their phone number. You may get their social security number. You're signing a document that says you're not going to share that with anyone outside your company. You're not going to post on Instagram or Facebook, if there was somebody in your hometown or somebody you grew up with, hey, John, you're not paying your mortgage, or, so an NDA is something that's very typical and common. if they ask for proof of funds or a letter of intent, typically they're a joker broker. If you were buying $1 million portfolio, that would be different. They would ask for proof of funds. But if you're interested in buying an asset for, $10, $20, $50,000, someone asks for proof of funds. Typically, it's not their asset, and they're trying to joker broker it. If they ask for a letter of intent, that is the biggest red flag because a letter of intent is pretty much one of the most useless pieces of information, documentation in real estate. At a property that somebody recently selling, and somebody sent me a letter of intent that says, I intend on buying this property, but I'm not giving you any money down. I have all my rights, and this piece of paper is non-binding. So I'm like, why bother even sending this to me? It's completely useless. So when people ask for a letter of intent, they don't understand the business. So so how many days the seller is allowed to do preliminary do you have to commit at this point? So, your preliminary due diligence process, I'll step back 1 second. So if you put a bid on an asset of, call it $20,000, that's the indicative bid. And then if it gets accepted, that is your due diligence period. Your preliminary due diligence, if you're referring to before your bid, that's typically, you get it done as fast as possible so you can get your bid in. If it's a rolling bid, if there's a bid due date, you just get your preliminary. But your preliminary, if I'm thinking right, is before you bid on an asset. It is that you do not spend any money. So never spend any money when you're bidding on an asset. So the only time you may consider it is, and I have done this in the past, is there are 3 assets in an area. I may hire someone on Craigslist for, pay them like $50 to go snap some quick photos of these 3 assets. But don't order a title report. Don't have a realtor, unless it's free. A title report I know isn't. Don't spend any money on your preliminary due diligence of putting an offer in. Once your offer is accepted, that's when you start spending money with the title report and a realtor. And like I said, that is typically between 7 and 10 business days is, I would say, standard. Some people try and push it to close in a week, especially as you get towards the end of the month, because people want to get stuff off their books, especially if it's a hedge fund, off their books by the end of the month. So they may say on the 22nd, hey, I'll sell it to you today, but you need to close by the end of the month. And it really depends on, many situations and stuff. But sometimes I say I can, and sometimes I'll say, look, I'd love to, but I don't think I can close by the end of the month. And it's all about communication. The more you communicate with people, let them know what's going on. That's when, things go much smoother. A few other warning signs, always buy off UPB and not pay off. If they're requesting numbers off the payoff, then the expectation is going to be very high unless of extenuating circumstances. Now, what's the difference between UPB and payoff? UPB is what's called unpaid principal balance, which is the balance that accrues the interest. The payoff includes, say the person didn't pay their tax bill and you had to pay the tax bill for them and you paid an extra $2,000. What they're paying interest in. So say the loan was $50,000 and, they paid it off to where the principal was down to $48,000, but they missed a tax bill. You pay that tax bill, the unpaid balance is still $48,000, but the payoff now is $50,000 because they owe you that $2,000 for the payoff. Now, once things start getting where they get behind, you get legal bills and taxes. Now, I have a loan right now that has an unpaid principal balance of, I want to say about $66,000, and the total payoff is $145,000. You're all probably wondering, like, shaking your head going, oh my God, what is going on? But the borrower, it's in Maryland, which taxes were $4,000 a year. Borrower hasn't paid taxes in 6 years. So there's $24,000. There's been about $15,000 in legal expenses on the property. There's been homeowners insurance, which is, basically $1,200 a year that hasn't been paid during that time, plus late fees and other fees that have accumulated have run it up, and it can run up pretty quickly. Now that asset, thankfully, is worth over $200,000. So, any legal and stuff gets protected, but there's a big difference between UPB and payoff. And the reason why you always bid off of the UPB versus the payoff is the payoff typically can get contested. If there's legal bills that were past a certain point or too old, there's statute of limitations that could come into effect. They might not be redeemable. So a borrower can fight the total payoff. And if they fight it, a lot of times, instead of spending more legal, what you do is you may knock money off of it. And basically, if it's, like that one in Maryland, if its payoff is 145, if they started fighting it, I said, okay, it's 130. Is that good? If I'm bidding off of the $67,000 is what I was bidding off of. To move some of that money, it's, almost considered gravy or slush, so you can have more flexibility. The other thing that can occur is what's called a cram down. So if the property ended up losing value and, say the borrower's principal balance was 50 and the payoff was 100 and the property was only worth 70, a cram down is when they ask the court to have those past due payments wiped out to the present value of the home, which some courts will do. So if you're, again, bidding off of that payoff of 100,000 versus the 50, and you bid at 70 cents at 70 grand, all of a sudden if that can knock down to 70 grand, you're not in a good position. Whereas if it was at 50,000, you bid at 70% at 35,000. If that number got knocked down, you're still protected. A few quick questions here is, what did you say BPO stands for? Andrea, that's called broker price opinion. It's basically a drive-by appraisal, or a CMA, a comparative market analysis by a realtor. Typically, you'll ask a realtor to run a desktop CMA with current photos. Some depends on the state. Some call it BPOs, but in some states, technically a BPO is, quote, illegal. So you'll call it a desktop CMA, or comparative market analysis. And what that is they run comps. So they'll look at 5 homes similar sold in the area, and then they'll have somebody drive by, snap 4 or 5 pictures for you. Hassan, can they put lien on payoff amount in the house? Not sure what you mean by that.
The attorney bill or other, if can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Yeah. The attorney bill or other things, can they put in the house? The PF amount, like not the unpaid balance.
So I'm sorry, you're a little far away, so I couldn't hear the whole thing. But the payoff can lien, but for the full payoff. So yeah, if it goes to a foreclosure or a bankruptcy, the full payoff is that lien amount. So if I've had instances where the unpaid balance was 10,000, but the payoff was 30. So when it went to foreclosure, basically the payoff, if somebody bid 30, I would get all of that money. So yes, so attorney bills and stuff can be, in most states, they can be added to the payoff. So it adds to the total amount due. So that is something that gets added. The one thing I recommend is always talk to an attorney ahead of time, because certain attorney fees in Ohio cannot be recouped. Ohio is a real challenging state, to say the least, because they've got a lot of quirky laws in Ohio, and it's a very, very borrower-friendly state. Another question came through is how much do you spend on due diligence? A title report I order typically runs about $135. The inch brush is about $500, between $300 and $500, because the title report will be $135. If you have a realtor do an analysis, that will run you $125 to $150. And then to have an attorney review the file, because I always have an attorney review the title report just to make sure something isn't missed or there's some random state law that for some odd reason on something, that can run you anywhere from $100 to $250. So depending on the state and the attorney. So you add, those items together and you're roughly about $500. So that's one of the things in note investing that, I talk to people about when they're starting to get into note investing. Sometimes, you may look to JV with people early on, because if you start bidding on notes and, end up doing due diligence and they turn into assets that are just, something's wrong with them, you just drop $500. That's a lost cost that you're not recovering. I had one pool of assets that I went after 6 assets and I tossed 4 of them away. So it was almost close to $2,000 just, gone, because, houses were, 3 of the houses were basically in shambles, and the 4th one had massive liens on it that, basically made the value basically useless. So it's one thing to always consider as you're starting going out is, what are the risks and rewards on things? And that's one thing I think a lot of people miss, is understanding some of the risk or upfront costs that could be incurred that end up being lost opportunity costs as part of note investing. So, so back to, again, wrap up some of these warning signs. You also always buy off of the, BPO, or what I mean by this is the current value of the property and what your realtor, your person thinks it's worth, not theirs, but also not ARV. You'll see a lot of people who are in the fix and flip side talk about ARV, which is after repair value. Okay, the house is worth, basically $30,000 now, but if you fix it up, it's worth $100,000. Well, as a note investor, you really don't care what it's worth if it's fixed up. You only care about what its current value is. So, always, because some people will say, well, the house, if you fix it up, will be worth $150,000. Well, that's great, but I may have to put $75,000 into it, and I'm a note investor. I'm not a rehabber. So that's a key one. As I mentioned earlier, if they ask you to close within a week, typically that's a big red flag. I've had one that I put some bids in. They're like, yeah, you need to close in 48 hours. I'm like, look, it ain't happening. And the guy kept going, well, what about 72? And I said, it ain't happening. I said, I need to get I'm not fast tracking something to make a mistake, or, basically don't allow me to order a title report, because that's just a sign that there's something else squirrely or wrong going on. So people ask to close within a week. That's typically a warning sign of they're trying to wholesale it and just try and get money out as fast as possible. And the last one is if they don't know who the servicer is. If you ask, well, who services this? And they're like, well, I'm not sure. It means they know nothing about the assets, because that's pretty much the number one thing everyone would know. So those are questions you can ask and some of the warning signs and responses. So here are some of the questions that you would get asked. If you reach out to somebody and said, hey, I'm looking to buy some notes, the questions they would come back and ask is, what states do you invest in? And starting out, I would recommend pick 2 to 3. Some recommendations might be Indiana and Michigan because they're non-judicial, but Michigan does have redemption rights in it. So that could be one, maybe not. It really depends. North Carolina has some positives to it. Virginia is a very fast foreclosure state, but it's very difficult to find assets in Virginia. Georgia, but you have to get a license. So, I wouldn't recommend, honestly, starting in Ohio or Pennsylvania. But Oklahoma is not too bad of a state. Actually, Mississippi and Tennessee are also good states, which are pretty quick as well. But it's really up to you on location. But if you're getting started, don't pick 20 states. Start with 2 to 3. I would start with. Reasons I put Indiana and Michigan is because that's where you're probably going to see the most assets. They'll ask you, do you invest in judicial or non-judicial states? Now, what that means is judicial states mean the foreclosure is through the courts. When you're foreclosing through the courts, your length of time to foreclose is going to be probably 2 to 3 times longer than a non-judicial state. Give you ideas, some non-judicial states, Georgia, 2 to 3 months, Virginia, 3 months. Indiana is, I think, about 3 months. Then when you start talking, other states, Maryland, I enjoy investing in Maryland, but you're going to be close to 9 to 12 months for closing. Pennsylvania, you're going to be a year plus. Florida, you're going to be a year. Ohio, you're probably 18 months. So you're at a much longer time period if you have to foreclose. So you always have to account for that when you're bidding on some of these things. But I always recommend for people starting out, start with the non-judicial. It's the quicker, easier process, and it's less hassle. Next is, what do you buy? So I put a bunch of acronyms down here, and I'll go through each one. And it's really what your preference is. But REOs, or real estate owned properties, they're actually not notes. You're actually buying the property. But some people will ask you if you buy those. Then there's first position notes, which is you're in the senior position. So you're first man to get paid. There's second position notes, which is when you're in the second position. And like I said, I don't invest in seconds. It's a whole different animal. But Martin Sines, who's lives out, by, I think, just past the airport, he's a big seconds guy, and has a lot of information on that. And the term NPN, which is non-performing note, which is something I invest in. And then, of course, there's PN, which is performing note. So non-performing note means the borrower is 90 plus days behind. Performing note means they're, basically current, or they still could be 30 days behind and still be considered a performing note. Next one is called a CFD, which is a contract for deed or a land contract. Now, these are a little different animal. I do invest in these. But the best way to explain what a contract for deed is, it's like when you go buy a car from Honda and you finance it through them. If you buy the car, you own it, you have to take care of it, but title is still held by Honda. And that's what a CFD is. So if I go buy a CFD that John Doe is a borrower on, the house is like the car. John Doe lives in it. He takes care of it. He pays the taxes on it. He pays insurance on it, but I still hold the title. So if John Doe ever stops paying, I don't have to foreclose on him in most states, except Ohio, of course. It's more of like an eviction. So it's like the repo man of, repos your car. It's basically almost like you repo the house and you can evict him, and it's a much cheaper and faster process. I'm in the process of doing this in Indiana right now on a property that it took about 45 days to get through the whole process. So it was pretty quick. Next is what you may hear sometimes. They're called scratch and dent loans. These are loans typically that a mortgage originator originated, and then it never passed Fannie Mae's guidelines. So they could be performing, they could be non-performing, but the borrower may have had too high of a debt-to-income ratio, may have lost his job, right before settlement and didn't get picked up, may have falsified a document or provided quote incorrect information on the loan. Scratch and dents typically sell for like 90 cents on the dollar. I tell most people don't bother with them because they're just not worth. They ask for too much. Sometimes people ask you if you buy hairy assets, and what it means by hairy assets is, those are the problem children. Think of, basically moldy fruit. Hairy assets might mean there could be, an issue with the title. They may owe a lot on taxes. There could be, something where it was supposed to be in probate and didn't go through probate, so you have to reopen a probate. Basically, hairy means that there's going to be some work that needs to fix a title issue or fix the property. Typically, these hairy assets sell heavily discounted. Sometimes 10 cents on the dollar. I have bought some in the past and actually have done very well with them. They just take a lot of time and effort to work through them. And the last, which is actually, I think, my favorite, are BKs, which are bankruptcy. And Chapter 13 bankruptcy is probably my favorite because it's basically being run by the courts where the borrower has to submit, their income statement. They have to submit all their bills. Everything about that borrower. So it's not like you're trying to figure out, does the borrower have a job, what other bills they have. They have to submit all that to the bankruptcy court. And if they stop paying while they're in bankruptcy, you can file with a motion for relief, get it pulled out, and foreclose. So it's, bankruptcy is a very transparent process. And I like to buy assets that have been in bankruptcy for 12 to 24 months because the bankruptcy process is usually around 60 months. And if you think of, bankruptcy, a lot of times people may run up credit card debts and they can't afford payments and so forth. So a lot of credit cards are non-secured. And in bankruptcy, the secured creditors, i.e. mortgage lenders, get paid first and their debt doesn't get wiped. Whereas unsecured, like credit card companies, may get 20 cents on the dollar and then get wiped out. So if you think of somebody who racked up very big credit card bills, and all of a sudden they're in bankruptcy and it's been 2 years in bankruptcy and they've been paying, the success rate of them getting through the bankruptcy is pretty high because they're looking at it from, okay, I got $20,000 in credit card debt. If I can make my payments for 3 more years, all of that goes away. If it doesn't, then it stays on my credit and I'll probably get foreclosed upon. So people, once they're in bankruptcy and start paying, people typically will continue to pay. If they fail in bankruptcy, they typically fail within the first 4 to 6 months. So another question will be, what is your property value range? Are you looking at properties, between 50 and 100,000, 250 to $500,000? What's your range? Some people buy $10,000 properties. It's completely up to you. Different property values have different, different criteria. Most of us here being in the Washington, D.C. area, basically, we don't realize housing prices compared to other places. I mean, we can buy city blocks in most cities compared to what we pay for a piece of property in this area. And it's not going to get any better with, all the new jobs that will be coming in next decade, but our house values will go up if we own homes. But so that's one that they'll typically ask you because they'll filter out assets for you that you look for. Same thing with what your PD criteria, what's your min-max. And what they're trying to gauge is, again, how much you're looking to pay. What's your buying criteria? You're looking to spend $25,000. You're looking to spend $200,000 on an asset, and that's what they're trying to get from there. Along with the next one, do you buy with equity or underwater? What that means is, if they owe $50,000 and the property is worth $100,000, that means they have equity. They have $50,000 in equity. If they owe $50,000 and the house is worth $40,000, they're $10,000 underwater. So that borrower may have a different mindset. So again, these are all a lot of just filtering questions because some of these places may have 500 assets and they're not going to send you 500 assets because your eyes will start popping out of your head. So, they'll try and narrow it down to 20 or 30. So, and last question sometimes they'll ask is, if you're buying performing, they'll say, what type of return you're looking for? You're looking for 8%, 10%, whatever your yield is. I always tell them, I'm looking for X% after servicing costs. If that's about non-performing loans, I say, I always tell them it varies because of, depending on the asset, the location, my bid is, I run everything through a calculator to, get to numbers, and I won't tell people what I try to get on, a seller, what I try and get on the performing side. On non-performing side. Performing side, I will, because, sometimes they'll say, hey, I'm looking to sell this at 6%. And I'm like, not worth my time. If it's 10 or 12%, I'll tell them, hey, I'm looking to get 10% on this, or I'm looking to get 12%, and see what they come back at. So these two lists, again, a lot of information. I'm trying not to overload people with too much information, but these are a lot of the common questions that, do come up and so forth. So I just wanted to share that with everybody. So does anyone have any questions? So last thing I was going to show people is, as you start getting involved in notes, how much money do you need? Because that's always $1 million question that people ask. And, you really don't need a lot. You can buy partials, which, I know people who do, and I sell partials all the time to people who have 5 or 10 grand sitting in an IRA. I'll say, hey, look, I can, sell you a partial for 10, 11, 12%, depending on the asset. So you can start collecting money on it and, have it sitting there for 2 to 3 years, because, trying to invest in something else might not. But, I wanted to show this. This is one that I recently had up, that I recently bought that, I've put out to people. This is a note in Gary, Indiana. It's performing. And Gary, most people know Gary's not the greatest place on the earth. But, there's a lot of places in Gary, just like in Baltimore, that are decent neighborhoods where people go and pay their bills. Just wanted to show this as an example. And, this asset has a UPV of $6,000. Property's worth $35,000. Principal and interest as well. They're only paying $68 a month, principal and interest, on this thing, but there's only $6,000 left on it. And it's 7.25%. 3-bedroom bath. It rents for $700 in the area. So if you're paying $68 a month and cheap rent is $500 or $600, the person's probably not going to, stop paying on this. They had a 10-year term where they made 3 years of payments already. They're up to date on it. You'd have servicing costs on this of, depends on who you use, $20, $25 a month. So, something like this would pay you $40 a month, or it would pay you about $400 to $500 a year. Actually, hold on, let me grab my handy calculator. So if you're paying servicing, it's 25. It's 20. You get about $500 a year, on it at, $3,000 investment. So, you basically be, 16% ROI, with the interest rate and stuff. It's, I think it pans out to about 13% return. So, these are a lot of notes, you can find off of people as well. That, I recommend if people are going to get involved in notes, to buy kind of their first note to go through the learning curve of getting something boarded or serviced, and learn the whole process and learn how to read a title report and all that other stuff. These are the type of stuff I always recommend people, because it's a $3,000 investment, which again, it's still money, but chances, if you're gonna, I'll say go broke on it, in the sense of, your risk is pretty much a $3,000 investment, which, in reality, something like this, I don't know how you could lose it, but I just wanted to show, this is an example to people, because everyone always thinks that all the notes out there are, you need $10, $20, $50,000. You can find stuff like this, that's out there. And, and if this isn't out there, again, the other option I tell people, if they want to get involved in this industry, is to look at some partials, and be happy to kind of share some information, with people what a partial is. But basically, you're buying payments of, 3 or 5 years of payments, on that note from somebody. So, But with that being said, that's all I had for tonight. Let's see how I'm doing on time. Basically just went over an hour, but wanted to try and keep it an hour for everybody. Does anyone have any other questions? I'll let me go to chat. Hassan, do I buy first or seconds? I only buy first. I don't buy seconds. I strictly, just do first because the reason why my background's in real estate, and this is I'd say a preference. First, you're more worried about the property value than anything, because at the end of the day, when you own the first note, you would end up getting the property back. So, I've been in real estate for 20 plus years, so I understand what properties are worth and can value them. With seconds, you are more concerned, with the borrower themselves and what's their mindset. Are they going to continue to pay me? Are they going to file bankruptcy? Are they going to just have the first get foreclosed on them and get you wiped out? Seconds, you hit a lot of grand slams, but also strike out a lot. So sometimes you get nothing, sometimes you do well. First, typically it's more consistent, singles, doubles, sometimes hit a home run. And, it's a preference where I'd rather work with understanding what the real estate value is than trying to be the psychologist and trying to read the minds of somebody I've never met or known. So that's why I typically I stick with first, but it's really a personal preference. Let's see. Andrea asked a question for these where it's more difficult. Locations, what I'm going to try and do is on these difficult locations, do what I did tonight, do a Zoom webinar. So people who can't come, basically can, sit from home and watch it online, listen, participate, and be involved as well, because I know it's tough. I mean, traffic around here sucks. I drive from Annandale to Rockville every day, go over the bridge, come back, and people who, somebody's up in that Rockville area getting out of work, and we have one down in Alexandria, and they live up in that area. That's not a great, that's a rough ride to come to a meetup group. But if it's up in that area, hey, it's not big deal. Same thing for you, Andrea. Being down in Northern Virginia, if we have one up there, I don't expect you to, haul up there all the time, so I can make these for both people. Sonia, I'll send you those links. Wait till Amazon here. Thankfully, that's 12. I read today 2030 is when they expected to fill that out. But the other thing that nobody's talking about is that Apple is also looking at bringing, I heard, 10 to 15,000 people to Tyson's Corner. So they were eyeing the space back in May, the same space JBG had that Amazon's going to acquire and develop with JBG. But Apple is looking at some property in the Tyson's area out towards Reston. So that would be, more more traffic. So unfortunately, I mean, with Crystal City, once that gets developed, my wife, we live out by the mixing bowl, and she drives into DC every day. So for her, I feel for her. Right now, I go up and down the Beltway, so that really wouldn't impact me. But once Amazon eventually comes, 395, Arlington, who was not, I think, pushing for these expanded lanes, they have to do something. Any other questions? Let's see, just looking through here. Hassan, I'll send you that link. Okay, spend on due diligence. Good. One last question I asked for people. So for the next meetup webinar, I was going to take some assets and send out a tape to people, and then at the meetup show people kind of how I break down a tape. Websites I use, how I put a bid together, just get people kind of understanding some of that upfront legwork that's done. Is that interest people? Would people be interested in that, or is there other stuff people would be interested in seeing? Okay, I got one. Yes, that would be interesting. Because at the end of the day, I want this to be collaborative with everybody, and I don't want to cover stuff that people are like, put people to sleep. So I want people to, definitely be interested in, what they show. And basically, with this being a new group, I'm kind of starting off people to start them through the phases of, not jumping to the end game first. Start with, how do you find assets? Some of the assets, they can start looking at, and then if you have one, how to start breaking down some of the important information to put bids. Because one of the things I do see from a lot of people who are newer in this industry is they get excited and sometimes they overbid on assets, especially ones that might have some quirky information to it, like this one I have up here with the low principal and interest. If that principal and interest payment was $200 a month, the price tag on this, the price tag on that note would go up considerably. And I see people on $20,000 assets that are only paying, $100 a month, paying $15,000 for them. And, I'll look at them and say, well, you're only getting $1,200 a year, and you get 15,000 into it. Do the math on what your return is. You might be in the single digits. So things like that sometimes, is just something that, always got to cross your T's, dot your I's. So, okay. Okay. So I'll reach back out to you. Good. Well, if nobody has anything else, like I said, I will send out these PowerPoint slides to people. This is recorded as well. I'm going to put this up, a link in the Meetup group. I'll probably just drop it on my YouTube page just for people. So they'll have a link to it so they can go ahead and if they want to go back, check something, listen to something, watch it. But in the meantime, too, if people have questions, feel free to reach out to me or others in the group. If there's either questions on something, questions about a vendor or an individual in the space, or anything in real estate in general, I'm happy to talk to you about it. So, but if there's no other questions, then I'll let everyone go. So thank you all for participating tonight, and hopefully we can see you there on the 12th or 13th. I'll let you know pretty quickly, once I can get that space wrapped up, which day it would be. So thank you all, and have a good evening.